It made me very, very nostalgic about the group. I lost my brothers, and hearing them, before we really were actually a famous group, brought back a lot of sad memories.
As the band approached its 20th anniversary, all the members were showing symptoms of a collective midlife crisis. They were beset by management and contractual problems, and they actually broke up for a short while after the Central Park concert after a massive row. Dennis and Carl were suffering serious drink and drug problems, and Brian's mental state was as precarious as ever. Dennis, whose solo album Pacific Ocean Blue was well received in 1977, got into trouble the following year when Arizona police found him in bed with a 16-year-old girl. Mike divorced his third wife that year, and in July 1978, all three Wilson brothers filed for divorce. In Dennis's case, from a woman that he'd married for the second time, only 2 weeks before. Towards the end of 1978, Brian was placed in a psychiatric hospital for several months. In his absence, Bruce Johnston, who had been missing from the band for most of the decade, produced a disco version of the song Here Comes the Night, the original of which was on the Wild Honey album from 1968. It was a classic example of how confused the band's bearings had become. The fans of the oldies hated its mechanistic rhythms, while contemporary disco fans saw it as a cheap bit of bandwagon hopping by some guys facing up to middle age without dignity. Although Brian was eventually released from hospital and even played live with his fellow Beach Boys on occasion, his mental state was not helped by his intake of illegal substances. It eventually transpired that Dennis had been making a bit of spare cash by selling drugs to his older brother. This he continued to do until Mike's brother Stanley, who was one of a succession of managers, and Brian's minder Rocky Pamplin, broke into Dennis's house and beat him up. Although this solved one aspect of Brian's problems, he was still in bad mental shape. At Carl's suggestion, he was effectively fired from the band and put in the care of a controversial psychiatrist called Dr. Eugene Landy. Landy had been responsible for Brian a few years before, but had been fired for charging excessively high fees. Now he took control of every aspect of Brian's life, gradually cutting him off from his family and friends. Many in Brian's circle were suspicious of Landy's methods, but they could see little alternative. For the other Beach Boys, life was veering between farce and tragedy. Alan Jardine, supposedly the most stable member of the band, divorced at the beginning of 1983. Meanwhile, Dennis had begun a relationship with a teenager who turned out to be the illegitimate daughter of his cousin Mike Love. They married in 1983, making Mike his bandmate's father-in-law, and Dennis's son, born before they married, made Mike a grandfather, a scenario that didn't do much to soothe tensions. The marriage only lasted a few months, but this time it was not divorce that ended it. Just after Christmas of 1983, Dennis Wilson drowned while swimming off the California coast. Most of the obituaries pointed out that he was the only Beach Boy who actually surfed. The death of his brother could have sent Brian into an irreversible mental decline, but it actually seemed to provoke him into a kind of creative renaissance. Dr. Landy deserved some credit for this, although people previously close to Brian were worried about his methods. The psychiatrist's treatment had certainly helped him to kick drugs, but his intense involvement with every aspect of Brian's life was bizarre. He even started getting writing and production credits on Brian's solo material. From now on, with the exception of a few reunions such as 1985's Band Aid concert, Brian and the Beach Boys would follow separate paths.
Yeah, Proud Mary. I have a track I made of Proud Mary, and it's so good. Hanging on to it for 5 or 6 years now. One of these days I'm going to find the right artist, the music, the singing, but the track, the background track is just, remember Tina Turner's version? It's a good version just like that one.
The success of Endless Summer had vindicated Mike's instincts that the people just wanted simple pop from the Beach Boys, and for a while Brian's solo career seemed to provide further evidence. His first work, entitled simply Brian Wilson, included the yearning Love and Mercy, a song that could have stood alongside his tracks from the mid-60s. At the same time, the Beach Boys came up with a daft sing-along called Coco Mo that graced the soundtrack of an equally stupid Tom Cruise movie, Cocktail. Kokomo became the band's fourth #1 single in the States, while Brian's album enjoyed only moderate sales. At least Kokomo was an original song. Other Beach Boys successes of the 80s and 90s included a cheesy medley of their own oldies, a take on the Surfari's Wipeout with novelty rappers the Fat Boys, and an atrocious remake of Fun 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 in collaboration with the British rock dinosaurs Status Quo. Perhaps worst of all was a version of the Mamas and Papas classic California Dreamin', featuring Roger McGuinn of the Byrds. This seemed to be a case of rewriting history, placing the Beach Boys in the Summer of Love pantheon with two iconic acts of American folk rock. As many critics pointed out, the Byrds and the Mamas and the Papas actually played Monterey. The Beach Boys stayed at home. After abortive sessions for a project labelled Sweet Insanity, Brian finally managed to extricate himself from Dr. Landy's clutches. He also managed to get damages relating to his father's sale of his songs in 1969, at which point Mike Love promptly sued him for songwriting credits on a string of hits. It seemed as if the legacy of the Beach Boys would be little more than lawsuits, madness, drugs, divorce and some exceedingly bad cover versions. Carl Wilson's death from cancer in 1998 simply added to the gloom. Brian's solo records, including Orange Crate Art, another collaboration with Van Dyke Parks, weren't tainted by the crassness of late Beach Boys product, but they weren't exactly setting the tills on fire. What if Mike had been right all along? Maybe the fans did really just want to hear the old songs. But it wasn't just the obvious crowd pleasers, the hit singles about surfer girls and little juice coupés that they associated with Brian. A new generation of musicians had rediscovered Brian's music. Pet Sounds was a particular favourite, and bootlegs of the Smile sessions also had a certain cachet. These fans included acts such as the High Llamas, Mull Historical Society and the Super Furry Animals in Britain, Daft Punk in France, and in the United States, acts as diverse as the Flaming Lips and the Wonder Mints. This last group was an LA-based art pop act who had moderate success since forming in the early 1990s. A chance meeting with Brian in a club saw them being co-opted as his backing band and becoming part of an audacious idea. Brian saw how well loved Pet Sounds was. Why not recreate the whole album as a live experience? Moreover, he would do it without backing tapes or sequencers, but with live musicians, including members of the Wonder Mints. It was a crazy idea, but no more crazy than the Beach Boys re-recording their old hits with country and western artists providing lead vocals, as they did in 1996. In 2000, Brian began presenting Pet Sounds as a live experience, and the audience reaction was ecstatic. Perhaps the warmest reception he received was when he played in London in early 2002. This was the audience that had taken Pet Sounds to its collective heart in 1966, when Brian's countrymen rejected it. These were the fans that didn't know how to surf but felt the heartache in songs like I Just Wasn't Made for These Times and God Only Knows. And this was the audience that roared its approval when, during I Know There's an Answer, Brian changed the lyrics back to Hang On To Your Ego, the phrase that had so offended Mike Love 36 years before. Brian Wilson had spent much of his working life alienated, isolated and damaged, constantly at the mercy of people who wanted to take advantage of him. Now he was among friends.
No, we're doing a completely different kind of set list. We've got some new revisions now. Yeah, but there's still some of the stuff that, you know, like Good Vibrations and Barbara Ann and Surfer Girl and In My Room and all those. There's those plus now we have about 5 or 6 new ones.
In the new millennium, the Beach Boys had ceased to function as a creative unit. Mike Love and Al Jardine fronted rival touring versions of the band, and they occasionally sued each other over naming rights. Their shows were popular, but serious music lovers were looking elsewhere. Brian, meanwhile, brought out an album of new material in 2004 called Getting In Over My Head, featuring contributions from Paul McCartney and a previously unreleased vocal by his late brother Carl. The success of the Pet Sounds tours, on top of the rekindling of the collaboration with Van Dyke Parks, had die-hard fans salivating. Much of Brian Wilson's position in the rock star firmament is down to the idea of unfulfilled promise. It's something that's applied to many other performers who either died young, Jimi Hendrix, Otis Redding, Kurt Cobain, or succumbed to mental, often drug-induced problems, Syd Barrett, Arthur Lee and more. The difference with Brian was that his unfulfilled promise had a name and a distinct identity. What, the fans wanted to know, was going to happen about Smile. After a discussion with Van Dyke Parks, Brian decided that it would be too painful to return to the tapes he'd made in the 60s. Instead, in 2003, with a band including Darian Sahanaia and Nick Verlusco of the Wondermints, and Jeffrey Foskett, an auxiliary Beach Boy for much of the 1980s, he attempted to recreate the album that he had envisaged back then. Anticipation was intense. It was like waiting for a Christmas present that has been under the tree for nearly 40 years. Would it be an anticlimax? After all, some of the tracks had become big hits in different forms. What was the point of re-recording something like Good Vibrations that everybody knows and loves in the 1966 version? When the album came out, however, the point was clear. Brian was a pioneer in developing what we now call the concept album. Smile has a coherence and identity all of its own. In short, the whole album is greater than the sum of its parts. Brian's intricate arrangements and soaring harmonies, Van Dyke Parks' weirdly affecting lyrics, combine to create something that doesn't necessarily make sense on an intellectual level, but it moves the most cynical of listeners. Brian Wilson's music, with and without the Beach Boys, serves to remind us of how powerful the derided genre of pop can be. The pain and the grace of his 60-odd years have fueled his desire to communicate just some of that power. Brian's soulful genius is as big as the ocean.
Thank you for buying Maximum Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy it or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye for now.